I know, isn't that nice?
Yeah, sure. No, it's okay.
We always this past
We haven't actually quite. I need to send out that email. So yeah. Correct. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything. Yeah. Good. Yeah, I would assume so. Yeah. I think Senator so we did. Yeah, so, oh yeah, far more than that, because I would be on the fly, right? Is this on camera? A or B?
like they do on comedy shows.
I'd be downtown Minneapolis. Yeah, so we'll be doing some of that. Yeah. Almost like a social summer. Yes. I know that I sound like them. I thought it was still good. There's a reason. Yeah, I know. Somebody
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the HumanistMN January Community Gathering. I am Ellie Halen. I am the president of the organization. And it's so wonderful to see such a good turnout. Thank you to our members and friends for joining, and for all of the new faces that I see out there. A special welcome to you guys. If you are new to our organization or humanism in general, I want to give you a little bit of background. HumanistMN is a secular community for ethical living. We are committed to the well-being of all and the sustainability of the planet, embracing the concept of human flourishing. We seek to champion secular and moral, civic, and political leadership. We are a home for those looking for a community of naturally curious, compassionate, and rational people who gather for friendship, personal growth, doing good together, and normalizing the non-religious naturalist worldview. We are also a very active organization. We organize primarily through Meetup, where most of you probably RSVP'd. So keep an eye out there for the extensive programming that we have throughout the year. We are an all-volunteer nonprofit, and we depend on the service and generosity of our members and friends to further our mission. We have many volunteer opportunities, such as marketing, media and tech, membership, programming, and social action. Please reach out to me or Audrey Kingstrom, who you're going to see in a little bit. We will be in the lobby after the program, and you can chat with us if you want to get involved. You can also sign up to volunteer in the lobby as well. I also recommend you go to our website, HumanistsMN.org. You can learn more about us there and explore opportunities to get involved. You can also sign up for our newsletter or become a dues-paying member. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're looking for the restrooms, if you go out into the hall and to the left, there are some down there, and also downstairs and to the left, there are additional bathrooms down there. Please make sure to stick around after the Q&A. At 4:30, we'll have our social hour in the lobby, and we would love for you to stay and socialize with us, meet some new people, and get better acquainted. And we'll be providing food and drinks, and we encourage you to please consider contributing with a donation to help us cover the costs. And lastly, I want to wrap up my intro with an exciting announcement. Some of you may know that we're going to have 2 billboards up in St. Paul, starting in mid-February, and they're going to be advocating for the separation of religion and government. And we were able to cover the cost of 2 months for the billboards, and we did a fundraiser for a 3rd month so that we could run through our May Day of Reason event, and it was super successful. We raised over $2,000, which was incredible. That was in a really short period of time. So we were really grateful to have that support, and it was really encouraging to see how many people find this a really important issue, like most of you here. We are going to be coordinating a photo shoot with one of the billboards, and our board member, Suzanne Perry, is going to talk a little bit more about that right now. So, thank you. Should I open this? Keep it closed? All right.
Hello, everybody. As Ellie said, I'm Suzanne Perry. I'm a member of the board of HumanistSMN. I'm also co-chair of the marketing committee. And I want to tell you about an event that's going to take place next month. It'll be a little different than what we usually do. So, as some of you regulars know, we have a community gathering once a month, and it's almost always here. Next month, we're going to move to St. Paul and have it at the Frogtown Community Center. And the reason is that the Frogtown Community Center is right across the street from one of the billboards that we're going to erect that Ellie mentioned. And so we thought, why don't we have our community gathering there, have everybody come and get photos of themselves in front of our billboard, and then we can put it on the website, distribute through social media, that kind of thing, and then we can amplify our message. In addition to that, we are going to have a more regular kind of community gathering with a speaker, and this is a special guest. His name is Qazi Ahmed Habib, and he is a student at Minnesota State University in Mankato, and he's head of the student secular group there. It's called Maverick Alliance of Secular Students. He also happens to be the winner of our first scholarship for secular students, which we awarded last July, or last summer sometime. And he's going to come and talk to us about his journey. He's an ex-Muslim from Bangladesh. He's going to talk about his journey to secularism, what he hopes to achieve with his secular student group, what they're up to, what secular students are thinking. He's going to invite some other secular students from Mankato, and we're hoping to get other students from different campuses like the U of M. We're going to put out an announcement and try and get as many students here as possible. So this would be a really good opportunity to connect with the next generation. We're always talking about how we can get younger people involved in humanism or secular advocacy. So this would be a good chance to do that. Just a note that the event will take place on a Sunday, February 19th at 2 p.m. So it's a little different from our Saturday schedule, but we hope to see you all there.
And
Now Marcy Woodruff's going to come to the stage for an announcement.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Marcy Woodruff, and I am co-chair of the Humanist in Action, our social action team here at Humanist Minnesota. And what I'm going to talk to you about is that today, after our wonderful program, we're going to have some postcards for you, if you're interested, a little bit of advocacy. After you hear our wonderful speakers, you may be inspired to want to ask your legislators to join the Secular Government Caucus or to thank them for already being a member. And so we have some postcards that will be out in the lobby where you can do that. They're pre-printed, and the only thing you need to know is your legislator. And if you don't know, no big deal, we have you covered. My lovely assistant Christine and I will be able to look that up for you, and we'll make sure that your postcards are addressed properly, and then we will mail them for you on Monday. So if you're interested in that, please see us afterwards outside, and we'll have postcards for you. If you are online, and thank you for everyone who is watching online, and you would also like to do a little advocacy and send an email or a postcard or a phone call to your legislator, please send an email to socialaction@humanistsmn.org. That's all little letters, socialaction at H-U-M-A, I'm not going to be able to spell it now, HumanistSMN.org, and we will email you everything you need to know about how to get in touch with your legislator with a little blurb, some sample verbiage, so that you can also encourage your legislator to join the Secular Government Caucus or to thank them if they already have. And we know who all those people are, so we will have you covered. It'll be real easy peasy. So please take a few minutes afterwards and do some advocacy. And next up is, I'd like to introduce the lovely Audrey Kingstrom. She is our program coordinator.
Thanks, Marcy, and it's great to see all of you out today. As I think most of you know, one of humanism's core values is secular democracy. And while that value is written into the US Constitution, it is increasingly being threatened in our society today. And that's why we've prepared this program for you today. For many years, HumanistSMN has been showing up at the Capitol in St. Paul to advocate for separation of religion and government on the National Day of Reason, which is held in early May every year. Last spring, at the Day of Reason breakfast that we hosted, Matt Lewellyn-Otten, who is one of our featured speakers today, joined us there in support. Matt was a rather new hire at OutFront Minnesota as a religious organizer, so we hadn't met him yet. He'd only been on the job less than a year. But what a wonderful connection we made in Matt, and he is a great ally to our cause. That day we learned of Matt's strong commitment to church-state separation as a person of faith, and their work with a few other advocacy groups to address the encroachment of Christian nationalism in public policy. So we've invited Matt here today to share with us the work that this group is doing with the hopes that we can build a strong coalition of secular and religious folks to ensure the separation of religion and government here in Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Matt.
Hi everybody, it's good to be here with you. Got my water, I should be okay for a little while to speak. I'm gonna make sure my computer comes up because I love a PowerPoint moment, I must say. My name is Matt Lewellyn-Otten, and I am the Associate Director of Religious Organizing at OutFront Minnesota. Let me get my PowerPoint up here for y'all. Oh, there she was. There she is. Hey. Okay. She's coming. That's not what I wanted to do, though. I need my notes. Oh, you see my notes now. I'm not going to look as smart as you think I am. No, I'm really not that smart. All right, Matt Lewellyn-Otten, the Associate Director of Religious Organizing at OutFront Minnesota. And you might know OutFront Minnesota. We've been around since 1987. We were established in August of 1987. I was born in June of 1987, so I like to think it's like a little birthday present to me. You know, a little queer Matt. Even though I was in South Carolina, somehow Minnesota knew I would be here. You all just knew. I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. I love y'all. I love to say the word y'all. I love sweet tea, banana pudding. It's just like all those iconic Southern things. And my wonderful husband is the one who brought me here. A lot of people are like, oh, how'd you end up in Minnesota? My husband grew up here. It's one of those things where everybody's attracted back to Minnesota, I feel like. Like, you leave for a little while, but then you come back. And that's my wonderful husband there. His name is Chris. I'm a retired first chair violinist. There were only 2 of us. But I was first. I love coffee, candy, and the Oxford comma. And that's our dog, Cooper. But Cooper just passed, but I wanted to pay homage to him. He just passed last week, but he's just a sweet pup, and we love him, and we think about him a lot. And yeah, I'm a former youth minister. I give off youth minister vibes. I know I do. It's who I am. I embrace it. You just gotta roll with it. So, yeah, I was in youth ministry for 13 years in South Carolina, in Boston, and now here in Minnesota. And then I got the dream job of organizing religious and non-religious people around issues that affect the LGBTQ community. And yeah, I've been gay for a really, really long time. But, you know, I grew up in church spaces, and I know a lot of the language that comes around in those religious spaces. So part of my work as a religious organizer is to connect. My work as a religious organizer is to connect people, to build relationships with them, congregational leaders, so that we can work together to move the spectrum a little bit more towards justice. I do a lot of coalition work, so I work with anti-hate groups, I work with reproductive justice, and I also, most of my work revolves around a lot of what I'm going to present to you today, which is the Rights, Faith, and Democracy Coalition of Minnesota. It's a terrible name, we're working on it. Give us some time. So this idea of, we're working around this idea of religious freedom, messaging around what that actually means here in Minnesota. And I activate people towards collective action, getting people to show up for queer people, to show up for queer students, so that they can express their desire for equality across the state. And then creating affirming spaces. A lot of religious spaces or spaces of conscience think that they are fully accepting and embracing of queer people, but maybe they just need a little bit more education. So part of my work is about creating affirming spaces as well. So, why am I here? What am I talking about? And what does this have to do with Christian nationalism? It has everything to do with Christian nationalism, I think, and undergirding that is white nationalism. And so, I am representing a coalition of 4 organizations here in Minnesota: OutFront, Gender Justice, Jewish Community Action, and TakeAction Minnesota. And we are a coalition that is funded under Proteus, and Proteus is a grant-giving institution. And what Proteus does is that they educate and mobilize philanthropy in order to raise and target desperately needed resources within different states. And Minnesota has been targeted as one of those states where the idea of religious freedom is kind of coming into the public sphere a little bit more. And we as a coalition see that white supremacy is progressing, and it's dressed up as Christian faith, which replaces reason, compassion, and empathy in the public square with dogma, exclusion, and apathy. And these right-wing groups work with lawmakers to enact legislation that institutionalize Christian practice through public law. And its agenda includes the promotion of Bible in public schools and the promotion of quote-unquote religious exemptions regarding women's reproductive health care, queer civil rights, and we're claiming to be, while they're claiming to be victims of injustice. So white Christian nationalists are cynically weaponizing the concept of religious freedom to advance a radical agenda that is eroding America's rights and liberties to live freely in our society. And this separation of church and state is foundational to a democracy that hears all of its people. And so we're trying to unveil this. We're trying to uncover this idea. So what are we doing? This is kind of our mission statement and where we are right now. So we as a coalition of nonprofit partners funded through Proteus's Rights, Faith, and Democracy initiative in order to drive messaging and create programming that combats the codification of right-wing Christianity into law, which limits the rights of reproductive justice, LGBTQIA2S+ people, people of color, and religious minorities. We are seeking to debunk the notion that white Christian nationalists are the victims of injustice. We understand that they are weaponizing the concept of religious freedom to advance a radical agenda that is eroding America's rights and liberties to live freely in our society. But really, I read that and I'm this. What does that mean? Honestly, we as a coalition are still trying to figure that out in a lot of ways. Ultimately, we want to create a messaging campaign that will reveal the ways in which religion has replaced reason. And we want to let Minnesotans in the United States to know that what undergirds what we are seeing played out in our politics and schools is a Christian right-wing nationalism. But we also know that we can't come right out and say that, right? That's a little scary to just come out and say that. So what we're doing is we're trying to create some messaging to stir hearts and minds in such a way that they begin to understand the separation of church and state is the cornerstone and the bedrock of our democracy. So, many months ago, you may have gotten a cute little email from me or maybe somebody else that asked you to fill out this little survey. We wanted to hear from our base. We wanted to hear what people are talking about, how people are thinking about this. And so you may recognize this little logo, you may not, that's okay. But many people filled out this survey. We had a great base of people that filled out this survey for us. And some of our goals included that we wanted to understand the language that people were using when talking about Christian nationalism, but we also wanted to educate our base a little bit. Who is this? What is happening? Those type of things. We wanted to build in a little bit of education when we're thinking about Christian nationalism. So, one of the main concepts that we try to include in our survey, and one of the definitions that we included, was this idea of Christian dominionism. And so we said some public officials have been affiliated with a religious movement categorized as Christian dominionism. And dominionism is the theocratic idea that regardless of theological views, means, or timetable, Christians are called by God to exercise dominion in every aspect of society by taking control of political and cultural institutions. This is a real thing, this is a real dogma, this is a real theology that undergirds a lot of what we see happening. And so this is the first kind of movement in theology that we wanted people to understand is undergirding a lot of what we see happening in public square. And then we wanted to bring attention to that this theology is also becoming institutionalized into movements. So there's organizations like the Project Blitz, and I was just explaining this. I sound like one of those people with like Post-it notes and yarn attaching all of it when I talk about this, and I know it, and because it's kind of the way it is. It's these organizations are then becoming really organized. These thoughts are becoming really organized, and they're organizing themselves. So we have things like Project Blitz, which is a coalition of Christian right groups that work with lawmakers to enact legislation that eliminates paths for legal interference of Christian practice in the public square, and otherwise seeks to alter long-standing narratives of religious liberty issues. Its agenda includes the promotion of the Bible in public schools and the codification of quote-unquote religious exemptions regarding women's reproductive health care, LGBTQ civil rights protections, and model legislation created by Project Blitz includes biblical literacy in public schools, recognition of Christian heritage, and like Christian Heritage Month or whatever, and Christmas Day, and displays of the national motto, "In God We Trust." So this is all a part of the work of Project Blitz. So we wanted to know, after people became aware of these groups, did they care? Like, were they actually concerned? And thank God they were. There is a big level of concern of our base of how these things are being organized, this theology that is undergirding. 82% would say that they are very concerned about this, and so I'm really glad that people are concerned and that there's something that they want to do. But what's really funny is, like, we also asked, would you be willing to like show up at a rally about this? And people are like, no. So, which I think is false now, because we have a large group of people here today, so thank you for being here to learn about this. I think people are wanting to learn and to understand this, and there is a deep level of concern. So we wanted people our base then, to kind of choose 3 areas targeted by the Christian right that are the most concerning to them. And as you can see, main area of concern of our collective base was reproductive rights. When asked to explain a little bit more about the responses, one person kind of shared a little bit. Conservative policymakers and courts in red states seem to be working all the angles to make abortion access difficult or impossible for women. And so we have reproductive rights here at the bottom with the most concern, LGBTQ plus rights, voting rights, democracy within itself, right? Civil rights, teaching about race and racial history in schools, women's rights, racial minorities, public health, religious minorities' rights, immigrants' rights, and then other. It's kind of fill in the blank, and it's not worth noting. So then we wanted to know the language that like people are using. So we just asked, like, describe it. Who's doing this? And so these are the responses. So we just kind of went through this qualitative research and kind of tried to figure out who these people are that people think that are rolling back these rights. And so I think one of the most interesting parts is to see what people respond with in these things. In Minnesota, non-Muslims regularly complain about the various ways in which institutions and employers accommodate Muslim practices, which was an interesting quote. More than rolling back rights, more attacks on places of worship, anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes, and leaders of the Republican Party have tried to restrict religious rights only to their approved mainstream religions, which they probably mean Christianity. So I think it's really interesting to think about the ways that people are talking about this. Maybe in their homes, maybe to their families, maybe to their friends, maybe it's just the way that they think about it. These are the words that mostly came up. Republican, Christian, religious, conservative, right-wing, white supremacists, and evangelical Christians. As a person who grew up in a more evangelical type of place in the South, Charleston, you might be surprised, really heavily Southern Baptist influence there in the South, I thought that the word evangelical was on the lips of everybody. So it's really interesting to hear that maybe we're not associating those words with who is trying to roll this back. And then we have much of the same reflection here when we're thinking about queer rights, right? Republicans, conservatives. One of the things that really stuck out is that they are associating this with elected officials, right? Republicans, all of them. They consistently hear bills throughout this country against LGBTQ rights. Even the small minority of Republicans who oppose these bills refuse to strong stance against it. They all care about winning deep conservative voices, regardless of the rights they take away. The white cis heterosexual privilege is rampant and disgusting. And then, one of the things that really perked my ears was policy leaders in Texas, but not in Minnesota. And it perked my ears because we might know that it actually is happening here in Minnesota. We even, last legislative session and even this legislative session, bills such as the Parental Bill of Rights has popped up. And I know that our representatives will be able to speak more about that, but this notion that it's not happening in my state can be a pitfall, I believe. Yes, we live in a progressive state, and we have the trifecta, as people are calling it. But it's important to remember that this is a part of a large, fully planned out picture of the conservative right. These aren't just one-off happenings. These are happening within our state. There's painful legislation for queer people being proposed constantly. Thankfully, we do have the trifecta, and things have been moving for the protection of queer people, especially trans students. But it does happen here in Minnesota. So we were left a little bit of like, okay, we want to know more. We want to know more about how are people talking about this. We want to know more how our messaging can be the most effective. So we partnered with a research organization called Perry Undum, and Perry Undum did a deep qualitative research with Minnesotans, and they have a process for kind of eliminating people and people that they want to think about this deeply. We know that we live in a predominantly Christian society, right? And so we even have Christmas trees that are just kind of a part of the culture, right? Or those are explicitly kind of Christian type of things. But we want to see the ways in which our state citizens think about freedom, even in a state that is largely Christian, Lutheran, right? How are they talking about the issue and whether people are deeply aware of the issue? And we wanted to reflect the language a little bit better of Minnesotans in order to have a messaging campaign that makes sense and brings clarity to such an abstract idea. And that's where our coalition has been struggling a lot, right? That's where I think we all struggle a little bit to bring some groundedness to such an abstract idea. And that's why I know I sound like a person who is a conspiracy theorist. So we hired Perry Undum to carry out this research, and using a newer method called qualitative boards. And over the course of 5 days, the team gathered information on participants' thoughts on freedom and the separation of church and state. So throughout the research, several boundaries of freedom emerged. So we wanted to get an idea of where does freedom end? Like, what are the boundaries of freedom? How are people thinking about this? How is the average Minnesotan thinking about this? So freedom ends when, it can't be detrimental or hurtful to others. Can't restrict another's freedoms. Your freedoms ends where my rights begin. We've kind of heard this rhetoric before, right? Shouldn't suppress the right of another, shouldn't oppress, shouldn't hold people back, can't impose on others, must respect others, can't break laws, should maintain separation of church and state. Yay! People talked about it, right? They talked about it. That was really exciting for us. Even though it was like a little bit of people talked about it, people were still talking about it, which was really great. So many people had really strong emotions when they were talking about this kind of Project Blitz, Christian Nationalism, and their threats. They were surprised. A quote, "I'm actually shocked and angered by this," somebody said. "Having this in place would take away freedoms. America is supposed to be the land of the free. I think this is terrifying, and it really worries me that more people are not aware of this." So people were surprised, but they needed more information to act, really. So we proposed this, this is a quote. "It's terrifying to me as a public school teacher and a parent that this is all happening without most of us knowing about it. I feel pretty informed about issues like this, and having very little knowledge about it makes me nervous that I'm going to sort of wake up one morning and find major changes to some pretty important parts of my life and beliefs." So we wanted to propose a definition of freedom that we argued about for months, it felt like. So we wanted to kind of propose this idea of collective freedom. Collective freedom is the shared responsibility of all of us to abide by the social contract that allows us to express ourselves and live authentically. If everyone doesn't have access to a particular freedom, it's not freedom, it's a privilege. People responded well, somebody says, even if everyone doesn't have access to a particular freedom, it's not freedom, it's a privilege. That seemed to really resonate with people, but they really weren't sure about this idea of a social contract, right? Rigid, really too far, it's like public policy jargon, honestly. But then we asked kind of what issues come to mind when thinking about collective freedom. We wanted to see where people go when they think about collective freedom. And the most common kind of things are systematic racism, discrimination, racial equality, white privilege, Black Lives Matter, access to jobs. A few said LGBTQ rights, gender, sexism. A few think of privileged people for whom equity will feel like losing freedom. Some have benefited from privilege, and then they reflect a little bit on the idea that freedom isn't a pie, right? You can't take more than somebody else. Free speech as a means to mistreat people. So when people were thinking about freedom, these were the things that really came up to them. Two alluded to religious freedoms in schools, and also schools mentioned Christmas as like Christmas time, these type of things. But then these were words that kind of came up when thinking about religion and freedom. This is a little small, so I'm going to read it. Finish this sentence. When it comes to religion, we must make sure everyone is free to blank, blank, and blank. Try to come up with 3 different words or phrases. So decide, choose, practice, be without fear, express, worship, pray. These are words that came up a lot. We also asked to define what religious freedom in America can't do. We wanted to know what religion and what freedom of religion couldn't do here. Overall, religious freedom couldn't control, is what people were saying. Restrict someone else's freedom or rights, be detrimental, hurtful, or harmful to others. But then we wanted to know what must it do. And they said, maintain separation between church and state. Woo! Respect religious freedoms of others. And then we asked main reasons for separation of church and state. People have different religious and spiritual beliefs. It's very personal. We have very different experiences, practices, and understanding. One group's values and beliefs shouldn't be standard, given preference, or imposed on everyone. I love that. I thought that was really insightful to think about the ways that people are thinking about this. And then we have words associated with judgment, with religion. Oops. That was a slip, wasn't it? Judgment, persecution, finish this sentence. Sorry, finish the sentence. So when it comes to religion, we must make sure everyone is free from blank, blank, and blank. So we wanted to think about the ways that people are thinking about religion too. So on the separation of church and state, there were some primary themes that kind of came about. What are the reasons? What are the primary reasons that 2/3 of our respondents say that there should be a separation of church and state? We have religious freedom, freedom of religion, and can freely live out our life without interference. People have different religions and spiritual beliefs. One group's values or beliefs shouldn't be the standard or given preference or imposed on others. People are talking about it this way. Secondary themes, some people are agnostic or atheist. One group shouldn't have power control over others. State laws are for everyone. Religion varies. Church is a choice. State is the law. Laws are about order. It's just really, really interesting to hear the ways that why people think this is important, because we want to be able to talk about this in a way that reflects the language that people are saying. About half of participants say they are aware of laws that blur the line between the separation of church and state. And so then we ask, what are those laws? What's happening? Where have you seen this happening? Abortion laws. We see abortion and the reasoning behind abortion bans being undergirded by quote-unquote Christian values. And then they talk about LGBTQ laws. Anti-LGBTQ laws don't say gay, right? That's when that was really coming about. Transgender restrictions, including gender-affirming healthcare, banning drag story hours, right? People kind of reflected on this. Education, people see this in education. Restrictions in schools related to sex ed, people reflected a lot about. Abstinence-only education is the main form of sexual education here in Minnesota. It's interesting to think about that a little bit. Teaching evolution, not teaching history, and then vaccine mandates. A few say COVID-19 vaccine mandate, vaccine refusal blurs this line. 2/3 say that they don't want religion to interfere with their laws. That's really exciting. People care. People shouldn't, the separation of church and state they're reflected on. Not all religions are the same. They don't represent all people. Some politicians use religion to control people, gain their support, and pass laws against abortion and LGBTQ people. So when we're thinking about this, what kind of stood out the most to us? Topics that stood out the most when people reflected on this issue of the separation of church and state, of religious freedom, of collective freedom. They're trying to control all aspects of American life. Seems controlling, they want to control everything, there's oppression. So we want to be sure that we're speaking in the same language. List of specific laws that surprised our participants. They were shocked about the teaching of Bibles in schools. They were really shocked about Project Blitz. Republicans have a plan to use conservative fundamental beliefs for politics. And then they're really concerned that this isn't being reported in the press. So what's next? We're doing some toolkit creation that we will be distributing to the public and also to our legislators, our leaders, thinkers. Further messaging research, we're going to be doing some A/B messaging research, conversations with community members and leaders and decision makers, and then we're going to be doing some talk about judicial education. And then we want to develop opportunities to lift up and engage people around the lived experiences of religious minorities. Training the metro and rural political organizers, engage faith leaders and train them on this rhetoric, and then teaching out in the community. We're also going to be keeping people updated, so I'm just going to keep this QR code up here, but this is a way to stay involved with us. You can sign up for our newsletter as things come out and as things evolve, get access to our toolkits and those type of things. I, of course, have gone over my time because I love this topic and I'm really excited about it, so I'm going to pass it over back to Audrey. So thank you so much, everybody.
There's so much to say, and we're so excited about the work that Nat and his group is doing, but we're also very excited about development in our own state legislature. One of the outcomes of our Day of Reason last spring, our breakfast, was further discussion with our legislative allies about forming a secular government caucus, modeled after the legislative Free Thought Caucus in Washington, D.C. Spearheading that effort were Senator John Marty and Representative Mike Freiberg. Both are longtime allies of HumanistsMN. They regularly attend and speak at our Day of Reason events. They tirelessly advocate for church-state separation and religious liberty, and often are on the forefront of supporting bills that many of our members are advocating for. They're currently recruiting fellow legislators to the Secular Government Caucus and have enlisted Senator Jen McGowan and Representative Athena Hollins as fellow co-chairs. And so we so appreciate the leadership that Representative Freiberg and Senator Marty are taking on this issue. And I really want to thank them also for taking time in their very busy schedules of legislators just going down the hall right now and for being with us here today. So we're going to hear from each of them now, giving a few remarks on sort of their take, their vision for this new secular government caucus, threats that they're seeing in the work that they do on church-state separation, and the encroachment of Christian nationalism, kind of what's happening, what they're seeing, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if I'll call on Senator Marty first, and then Representative Freiberg. And so if you could both make a few remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be with you, and Matt's comments are very helpful. Project Blitz, most people hadn't heard of. I hadn't heard of it until a few years ago when the Minnesota Prayer Caucus folks, which is involved in all this, the Legislative Prayer Caucus, which is 100% Republican members, not all Republicans are members of it, but they're only members that are Republican. They started pushing posting of In God We Trust in the schools. Schools didn't have to pay for it, but anybody could volunteer to give them posters or plaques or whatever, and they put them up in the schools. And I had some real strong objections to that, and I spoke, I told people, I'm the great-grandson, the grandson, the son of Lutheran ministers. Got a brother who's one and a daughter who's one. I take my faith seriously, but I also take the faith or non-faith of others equally seriously and believe that's very important. So I spoke against this thing. I said how I thought it was offensive that we have money says, in God we trust. When my religion talks about how God who threw money changers out of the temple and didn't like that stuff. Anyhow, somehow that one of my colleagues, who had pushed the bill, got that on Fox News on a Sunday morning. And I came home from church, of all places, to some viciously vile hate messages on my answering machine, saying how I hate God, hate this, and so on. And what happened? Where is this all coming from? My phone number, my home phone number is public, but don't usually get calls on it, and got several of them. And that afternoon, Fox and Friends called and said, well, you want to debate this issue tomorrow morning? So I agreed to debate it. And with somebody who wasn't debating, she was just speaking. She was in their studio. I'm in a studio in Minneapolis with a little camera there and nothing but that. I can't even see the person I'm debating with. Seeing it afterwards, and she was clearly in their studio and chatting with them and everything else. And telling them how I don't hate religion. I don't like people stepping on the rights of others. And And through that, after the Fox and Friends things, I heard from a researcher who has done the exposition of what's been going on with Project Blitz. He got hold of their playbook, 100 and some page guidance, how they try and get the little things like in God we trust, or put in 10 commandments here, or things like that on public property. And then the next steps are, of course, the bigger issues are LGBTQ rights, their abortion stuff. That's their number one reason for being there and why they're trying to do it. It's a misogynistic and horrific group that preaches a lot of hate, but it's right-wing Christian nationalists. And they try and crush everyone who disagrees. Anyhow, I've been working on this more since then, and because of Humanists and other groups, and Representative Freiberg and I agreed last summer, last fall, that we were going to form a coalition caucus so people could talk about this. And a lot of interest. I think we had 24 members on one email we sent out, and we're reorganizing now, and Mike just sent out a thing. I don't know the results yet, but we're asking people of both parties if they want to join. We expect it'll be mainly of our party, but my party, which is Democratic Farmer Labor Party, but there may be some others, I hope so. And we introduced, I've already done so, I think he may have already, a bill to take January 16th and declare that as a Religious Liberty Day, because that's the anniversary of the 1786 or so Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. It was written by Thomas Jefferson. Everybody saw it as the model for the First Amendment and religious freedom of conscience and separation of church and state. When I introduced that bill a couple months after the In God We Trust fight, the senator who posted that, he said, "Oh, Senator Marty, I saw your bill for a Religious Liberty Day. Would I like it?" And I said, "I certainly hope so." I can guarantee he wouldn't, because it talks about how we should do this. What are they after? I found a wonderful quote from that says, it's an awful quote, but it's blunt about what they're trying to do. A guy named Gary North in 1982, one of the Dominionists that talked about Dominionists, saying how we have got to use, he didn't use the word guise, but we've got to use something like the guise of religious liberty to build up to train people so we have people educated in every aspect of society, culture and religion and politics and everything, so that we can take over, so we can build up Christian schools so they can attend this and learn our stuff, and then they can take over the courts and everything else and so on. And then we can finally deny the religious liberty of those who oppose our God. In other words, it's not religious liberty, it's Christian nationalism, which is what they're trying to do. But the fact that he openly says we're trying to do this so that we can crush religious liberty for others. That's why my colleague asked if my religious liberty resolution was something that he might like. And we've seen this play out a year later there, and I didn't know it was related at first, but in our Senate Finance Committee, there was a proposal by a Republican senator who was putting out the budget for historical societies. They were cutting a lot of things by 5 or 10%, and Historical Society was being cut by like 30, 40%. Huge cut in Historical Society. Why? And the woman who was presenting the bill, when asked about that by one of my colleagues, she said, "Well, because of the controversy." And I asked, "What controversy?" "Oh, it's secret." She said it was secret. It was bizarre. Anyway, and it came out later, one of her Republican colleagues, "Well, it's because they put on the sign Fort Snelling et Bedote," which is the Indian term for the conjunction of two rivers. And that's all we heard then. But I heard later from Historical Society and a historian from Oregon or Washington who has written about this. He was invited to speak at the Historical Society's fundraising annual event. It's it's not a state agency, it's a nonprofit. He was speaking on a book he had written about the fiction of a Christian nation, that we were founded as a Christian nation. He was saying it was fictitious, and he's a religious scholar, and he was well researched. The board has been, I think it was Oxford University Press or somebody. Anyway, he was presenting this, and the Historical Society got a letter from the Legislative Prayer Caucus, the same folks involved in all the other stuff, saying, we demand that you let us, you cancel this guy, and they wouldn't cancel him. It's their private event. Okay, then we want you to let us speak too, and we'll debate him. And they had a series of letters, and at one point they said, we want you to let us know soon because we're putting together legislative budgets. And so basically a direct threat, we're gonna cut your funding if you do this. And fortunately, Historical Society stood firm. It was a bizarro thing. One of the letters they talked about, this I can't think, Steve, whatever his name is, the historian who wrote the book. They said, this book was filled with lies and misinformation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And later on he says, yeah, we got a copy of the book, we're hoping to read it soon. I mean, they hadn't even read the book, but they knew it was full of that. Anyway, we're up against that. We've decided we want this prayer caucus that they've been doing for so many years, the Congressional Prayer Caucus. They are the ones who founded this Project Blitz. And our side, as Matt pointed out, people are, what's this, what are they doing? Oh, I didn't know this was a plot. And so we've got to, it's not a conspiracy theory, they're just actually doing this, and they'll tell us their Project Blitz thing. The author who exposed that got a copy of it, and then they took it offline. It was easy to access, they took it offline then, but he got a copy of a later one a few years later, which is the same sort of stuff. So we know what they're up to, we're fighting it against it, and Mike has been helping make this wonderful caucus, and I think we're gonna have, I don't know, well, I'll let you talk about how we're doing it. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I have some notes on my phone, so I might refer to that occasionally. So I apologize, my attire is middle school quiz bowl coach uniform. Although I do think actually, the difference between Senator Marty's attire and mine make it kind of a good microcosm of the distinction between the House and the Senate. I've been not allowed onto the Senate floor a couple times for not wearing a tie and jacket, so, but that sort of thing happens. So we got the suggestion to start a secular government caucus. It was Suzanne and Audrey actually originally kind of gave us this suggestion. And a fun fact about Audrey, she'll be giving the, let's just call them remarks at the opening of a Minnesota House session soon. We do start every session of the Minnesota House of Representatives with a prayer. That's not exactly a great example of the separation of church and state, but at least now they are expressing willingness to have humanists come and speak to the House before our session. And Senator Marty and I, we spent some time talking, as well as our other chair, Senator McEwen and Representative Holland, spent some time talking about what initially it was, the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. The second we talked about maybe it should just be the Secular Caucus. We came up with Secular Government Caucus because, whether you're a person of faith or not, I think there are, as we've seen from Matt's presentation, most people support the separation of church and state, and we didn't want it to seem exclusive to people who were religious. Senator Marty is a man of a deep religious faith. He comes from a deep religious background. I am not and do not. So just two of the co-chairs, there's a pretty big distinction there, and at least in terms of diversity of religious views, we want that to be an important part, and we just want people to come together, regardless of whether or not they consider themselves religious people, who support the separation of church and state. So our mission, I just wanted to read our mission statement, is to promote public policy based on reason, science, and moral values, protect the secular character of our government by adhering to the constitutional principle of separation of church and state, oppose discrimination against all people, whether religious or non-religious, atheists, agnostics, humanists, and seekers, championing freedom of thought and conscience, provide a forum for Minnesota legislators to discuss their moral frameworks, ethical values, and personal religious journeys. So we don't know whether we'll be, taking views on specific pieces of legislation or issues facing the world, but we just, we feel it's important, just given that there is such an active and organized effort to enshrine a specific religious view in American government, in Minnesota government, we feel it's important for people to be able to come together who feel that religion and the state should be separate. And just talking about it can be controversial with people. So I mentioned our Secular Government Caucus in the EE update I send out once or twice a month during the session. And I sent this out to constituents. I got some interesting replies, so I just have a few of them here. I got an email from one person that said, "Christian nationalism? Surely you're joking." Somebody else replied, "Please tell me what Christian nationalism is. I'm a Christian and I've never heard of it. I live by 3 principles: faith, forgiveness, and minding my own business. I believe a lot of Christians follow those principles and more. Is this a problem?" So then I just Googled, I do try to reply to my constituents, so I Googled Christian nationalism definition, and I found quite a few things, including from what I assume are, Christian sources. So Christianity Today, which I assume is a Christian website, that said Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Popularly, Christian nationalists assert that America is and must remain a Christian nation, not merely as an observation about American history, but as a prescriptive program for what America must continue to be in the future. So I sent that. It seemed like a pretty good definition. I sent that and a few others back to this constituent. Haven't heard back yet. Another one I got. This one I just kind of want to hear. I've heard a lot about this issue, but I haven't really talked about it with anybody. So I'm kind of curious where people here. I may ask for a show of hands. So one person wrote me what I thought was an interesting question. "I'm sure that your secular caucus will publicly come out on the side of the professor at Macalester College," he means Hamlin, "as you seek to support our constitutional separation of church and state." And I see what he's getting at, but I kind of thought about it. So I'll just read my response, and then I think I'm going to ask for a show of hands to see who agrees with me, because I honestly don't know where people fall on this issue. I just said, "I can't speak for other members of the secular government caucus. I don't know if we will take a position on issues generally. But speaking for myself, I found the treatment of the Hamlin professor appalling. It seemed like she did everything correctly in terms of providing notice to students about the content of the course, but was punished anyway. I think the phrase academic freedom gets overused and misapplied at times, but this does seem like a case where a professor's ability to teach relevant material was being inappropriately muzzled. Hamlin is a private university and can adopt whatever policies it wants, but this whole thing reflected badly on the school." I don't know, show of hands if you agree. All right, cool. I don't know. The liberal part of me kind of was afraid to say that, but I am pretty liberal. So okay, cool. Somebody else. Well, that's probably enough. I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of, as legislators, the sorts of things we hear. On Thursday night, we in the House, we spent several hours debating the Protect Reproductive Options Act, and we passed it. It was a close vote. I was glad to vote for it. Certainly, in the arguments against it and the arguments that have been made in the past about legislation that wants to enshrine restrictions on the fundamental right to reproductive health care, including abortion care. A lot of the arguments you hear do tend to be religious arguments, and we certainly heard plenty of those on the floor on Thursday. So this is gonna keep happening. It was a really close vote in the House. I'm sure it'll be a close vote when it comes up in the Senate, so make sure you reach out to your legislators about that issue, as well as other issues. And I think that humanists need to be very involved in government and lobbying their legislators. So I'm glad that this group's here, and it's an honor to be able to speak to you. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. All right. Am I on? No, I'm not on. Okay, now I'm on. All right. Yes. Speakers do come up to the, we did. Let's give them a big round of applause again for coming out today. It's so great to have you folks here. So I'm going to start up. If people have a question, you can kind of queue up, or there's a few empty chairs here now, but sort of queue up and try to keep your questions short and focus on asking a question as opposed to making a long statement. But I'm going to start out here with a question for our panelists here. And I'm going to start first with you, Matt, and then to the legislators. A very similar question, but a little different because you have different roles. So Matt, I'd like to know how you see HumanistSMN working with your emerging coalition. Because I know you have, they're mostly non-sectarian groups, I suppose not Jewish Community Action, but non-sectarian groups, but you have religious people, and I know you're the religious sort of organizer for OutFront. But how can a group like us, that's clearly secular, but we are allies, how can we work with and support the work that you're doing and form some kind of coalition? And then, so you guys can be thinking about this, you legislators there. How can HumanistsMN support the work you're doing, especially with the Secular Government Caucus? And how can we help change that language that when we're discussing policy, so to focus on inclusive, secular, humanistic, democratic values that inform public policy, as opposed to the religious language and dictates that so often come forward in discussion. So how can we be helpful?
I think one of the main things that's helpful is to keep the conversation going, is to continue to think about this in a really thought-provoking way that leads with compassion too, that leads with grace and kindness and compassion. But I think the main way is that we can keep this conversation going. We're also going to be doing some messaging, so helping to get that messaging out to people so that they have a good way of speaking about this in some capacity. We hope to really work with our legislators in a really productive way too. And so continuing to urge your representatives to think about this deeply, join the Secular Caucus, right? The Secular Government Caucus, and that this is an issue that you really care about as a citizen. This is something that you deeply think is troubling, if you think it's troubling. Maybe you don't think it's troubling, but if you think it's troubling, I encourage you to write your representatives and to speak up. I think that's a really big way that y'all can be allies in our work, but I deeply appreciate the opportunity to keep the conversation going, and for y'all to keep the conversation going as well.
I think the way to help our Secular Caucus with Marcy's efforts of sending out postcards to encourage people to join or whatever, I think those are very helpful things. The Secular Caucus, even if it didn't exist, we're still, Mike's been doing this a long time, I've been doing this a longer time, but been fighting for the values humanists care about. And that's what we have to be fighting on, this religious issues, religious church-state separation. We shouldn't have to fight those fights, but we do have to fight them, so that's why we're doing this caucus. We can talk about these things together and how they're using this to thrust their religious beliefs on others. And to me, we're going to keep fighting on, as Mike said, they passed the Reproductive Rights Act. We have that coming up in the next week or two, and we are right on the edge of making this thing happen. We need people to be speaking out on those issues as well, but in terms of our caucus itself, what you're doing with the postcard thing is a really helpful boost to people. Say, hey, somebody appreciates it, I'm joining this.
Yeah, is this on? Okay. I think letting your legislators know that you're out there, that you're coming at this from a humanist or secular perspective, I think is really important. I think there's been greater historically, the public acknowledgement of non-believers, I think hasn't, and just secular beliefs and the separation of church and state hasn't always been great. I've been in the House now for 10 years. I remember my first term, the Minnesota Atheists came to the Capitol and had a day there, and they had this big banner that says like Minnesota Atheists in big letters, and I think the only legislator, one of the only legislators who would come there was former Representative Phyllis Kahn, and I went there my first term and spoke to them and stood under the big banner that said Minnesota Atheists, but I remember then I think Representative Kahn spoke and she said something like, for years I've been the only legislator willing to come here and stand under this banner, and the fact that Representative Freiberg is here now means I was successfully able to double the number of legislators willing to speak to the Minnesota Atheists. She was, I'm sure Senator Marty would have been perfectly willing to also, that was just kind of her style, but it does kind of, I do think there was a reticence of among many legislators to see that. So I think the more they hear from people who come from a secular background, the more it gets normalized. And sure enough, I mean, every time I've been and gone back there to speak to them, it seems like there's been a couple additional legislators from the number there were 2 years ago. So I think it's improving, but I think certainly, the more you can do just to normalize separation of church and state, atheism, secular beliefs, humanism, whatever term you prefer to use, I think is really important.
So I think, yeah. So I was involved in a political campaign this past fall, helping a friend run for school board in Minneapolis, and I didn't really know a lot about some of the struggles. I mean, I knew the obvious struggles facing the public school system, but I didn't know about some of the more insidious ones, and things like where we have the Minnesota Parents Alliance. Sounds like a great name, right? And their mission, Minnesota Parents Alliance educates and empowers Minnesota parents to effectively engage in their school community as strong advocates for academic achievement, equality, and parental rights. Maybe it's that last two words, parental rights. But part of it is, whipping up parental fears about their children being groomed to, become gay, or what, as if they can become gay just because they have a teacher tell them something, whatever. Yeah, right, yeah. But so there's two parts of this, because I think it's a really insidious thing. There's so many people, they see this, maybe they just see the mission statement, they're maybe not cueing in on some of those code words, but they think, why wouldn't I want to be part of that or give support to it? But that's also a kind of a front, if you will, for some of this Christian nationalism and how people get elected into other offices by bouncing up through the school board system. So two questions, and also part of their thing is to take away public school money from the public school system and help funnel it towards private schools. So I know Governor Walz is talking about education a lot this term, more so than maybe anybody's talked about in the past. So how likely do you think this will be that we can get some good reform and make sure our public school system is well funded and that we keep public school money or public school dollars with the public school system? And then, this maybe isn't in your purview, but how can we rip the curtain off of some of these groups that masquerade under these names that everybody thinks, well, why wouldn't I like that? To show this side that, really they're a front for Christian nationalists. So.
Well, sure. So first I think this is going to be a historic session for public schools. I mean, the governor is a former public school teacher. We do have a DFL trifecta, both the House and the Senate and the governor's office are all under DFL control. But there's very narrow majorities in the House and the Senate. I do think the one thing, and there's a $17 billion surplus. So I think we have resources to invest in something. There's going to be a lot of competing demands on that money for sure, and it'll be a big fight. But I do think one area where even the narrow majorities, even the Democrats and conservative in more rural areas, I think one area we can all agree is funding our public schools. So I'm really hopeful. I'm a public school parent and quiz bowl coach. I just want to mention. By the way, the team they made it to the playoffs, but unfortunately they lost in the first round. That did enable me to get here on time, though. Making it to the playoffs was pretty exciting, though, for them. So. My daughter's on the team there, so Plymouth Middle School. So. I totally lost. You had a second part that I wanted to talk about. The whole parents' rights, issue. One thing that the other side has done very effectively is just the whole messaging thing. I mean, you hear terms, and that's why some of the work that people like Matt do is so important, because I think it's incumbent upon us. Obviously, I feel like we have the correct position, but it's important for us to be able to counter their arguments, to point out what's really going on and what they really mean. I mean, a lot of times when they talk about parents' rights, I mean, that sounds like a great term, but when the way they describe it, it's their right to tell your kids what they can believe, what kind of person they can be. they're talking about, imposing their views on other people. And I just think we need to make that very clear, and that's why it's just, it's so important to, the research you're doing, I think, is so important and can help us counter some of those narratives.
I'm going to focus on the second part of that about how school board meetings, if you know school board members, they're very smart, competent people for the most part, and they two things. One, they care about budgets, and two, they care about kids. And school board meetings used to be as dull as anything. You don't want to go to them, they're just too dull. And now we got nationally, we have school board things making national news because of people going in and saying, I got a right to be as mean as I want to be to you because I'm a person and I can attack you because you're our school board members. And it's very scary, and that's why I think this whole discussion, the whole nature of secular government and the nature of all this and the exposure that Project Blitz is exposing what Project Blitz is up to is so important, because it is, when you were saying, you don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but they do have a conspiracy to take over things, and they're doing it in a very hateful, destructive way. And I talked to a school board member from Osseo recently who's been on the board. She's got a transgender daughter, and the thing she said, we passed all these great things in the last few years. Now, after the last election, it's 3-3. 3 of these right-wing critical research, critical race theory, and anti-gay, anti-everything else. You got 3 members of a 6-member board on that. They haven't even been elected chair yet. And what happens here? All of a sudden, people come out and they bullet ballot on those school board elections and so on in order to win their people. And I think we have to be more informed about it as a society. So the best thing we can do together is to help educate and get the media to talk about it. Make sure people understand what's happening.
Okay, I'll have a question, but first I got a little education because I like getting people to learn about things. Another term for Christian Nationalism comes from NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation, is sort of an overview of that, so if you look that up. And then also there's a really neat podcast I've discovered this fall. It's called Straight White American Jesus. And it's a great name. They've done a lot of stuff, but they did a 5-part series called Charismatic Revival Fury, which looks at the New Apostolic Reformation, as well as their involvement in January 6th. So it's a 5-part series, so check that out. It's on their free part of their podcast, and I'm a big fan of podcasts because it's a great way to do dishes and cook on that part. So my question is, I'm big on libraries. I have a free little library in my front yard. I'm a member of my local library friends group with a bunch of little old ladies. And we are taking care of my neighborhood library in North Minneapolis. So there's been a lot of attacks on libraries and their books. What are things we can do to help do that? And are there any things you guys can do at the legislative level to help us with maintaining the freedom of our libraries?
No. Somebody's got to respond. I'll try.
No easy answers.
No easy answers, yes. Library freedom and what's happening, and again, that ties in with the last one about school boards and so on. When you have people banning books, scary times. And I think that's what we have to watch out for, and I'm not sure there's a simple answer. I think what we have to do is keep speaking out for that, showing up. I mean, Minneapolis and some communities have library boards, elected library boards, making sure we have good people on them. But bottom line is, it's all this whole thing about, let's make sure the public is hearing something other than we are a Christian nation or we are whatever, because our Constitution very clearly, the nation's founders weren't perfect people, but even Thomas Jefferson in his writing in the First Amendment, he spoke later in life about, because knowing how they would construe it now to be saying, oh, we want to protect religious liberty, let our people discriminate against LGBTQ people or somebody else in our businesses because of our conscientious beliefs. No, I mean, you're allowed to discriminate against people? No, you can have your personal beliefs, but in your business, you do your businesses. That kind of whole area of our law and the courts have not been very helpful in recent years on it, or not as helpful. And I think we have to be educating people on it. That's the biggest thing I do. And make sure any way you can. I mean, friends of the libraries are the kind of things we have to push.
I was wondering about if you've done, speaking about your group, if you're familiar with Catherine Stewart. She's written a couple books about, you know, the insidious nature of religious groups in schools, you know, like there's African Club and things like that. Anyway, she might be a good resource as far as, because I think she still keeps up with all that kind of thing. And same with Andrew Seigel. He used to be Freedom from Religion Foundation, but now I think he's with Americans United. And he's written a whole book on white nationalism, and of course being with FFRF, you know, they you know, keep track of a lot of that stuff too. But anyway, might be some good resources. The other thing was, you mentioned, you know, respect for religion, you know, that you have to respect other religions. I don't know if, and it's kind of what John said about, you know, if your religion says you can, you know, do this stuff, I'm not gonna respect it. I mean, you know, as long as, or, you know, if you can't eat bacon, well, that's fine, you know, it's nothing to me if you don't wanna eat it for yourself, but, you know, as long as you don't start discriminating against my, you know, choice to do that, or, you know, I mean, that's the silly one, but, you know, some of these other things. And so I think sometimes having to say we have to respect other people's beliefs is maybe going too far. They're allowed, you know, people are allowed to have them if they don't hurt other people, but I don't necessarily have to respect them. So I, you know, sometimes I think that's going actually a little bit too far as far as how I look at things. I respect your right, but I don't respect where you go with it necessarily.
That is an interesting perspective. I think one of the things that I'm thinking about is use of space, and maybe when we're thinking about use of space for prayers for somebody who's non-Christian, right? We still need to have the space and be able to respect their space in some way so that they can have their midday prayers, right? We want to be able to provide some type of avenue for people to still be able to express themselves in some type of way, but we don't want to take away the respect that they deserve as human beings in their religious practice, right? We want to decenter the Christian hegemony, right? We want to decenter that so that we can think about the people who aren't in the rhetoric, right? Because in a lot of ways, yeah, maybe we don't respect Christianity, or, you know, you could not respect Christianity, yeah, but there are other religions. There are people who have been fighting for their right to express their religion in some kind of capacity and have the respect that they deserve as a human being to be able to have a prayer space in, you know, or be able to have their prayer rug out and be able to pray. So it is an interesting perspective of that people reflected on this idea of respect, though. But then at the same time, I think people also reflected on the ways that where other people's rights end and mine begin, right? They still reflected on that too. So then, how can we build rhetoric that maybe we need to use a different word than respect? Maybe we need to think a little bit more, shifting our thinking in the way that we think about religion, because often our mind just goes to Christianity. And so maybe we need to decenter Christianity, this idea that we are a Christian nation, and because we're not. And how can we include the religions that so often aren't spoken about?
The last sentence of your question, you sort of, I thought, answered. You say, I can respect their right to their religious beliefs, not respect what they believe. I think that's part of it, and the other part is respect them as a person. You don't be vicious to people because they're vicious, but you can respect that they're a human being and they deserve certain things too, but no, I think it's clear the difference between respecting their right to believe, homophobic or anti-trans or people who want to control other people's lives. I don't respect that at all. I respect their right to believe what they want, but again, that's the whole issue here. So I think it is a difference. You can respect their right to believe, and I think it's appropriate we make accommodations. I'm glad schools have learned their Christmas programs aren't Christmas programs anymore, and prayer rooms and so on for Muslim workers and so on, I think are all kind of accommodations for that. And reasonable accommodation is reasonable. We try and respect the person. You don't have to respect or agree with anything they say.
We're going to take time for these last two questions. We'll try to keep them short.
Don't worry, it's a quick one. So I got Mike, Marty, what was your name again?
Matt.
Matt, hi. Oh, got the 3 M's going. The statistics, wonderful. The facts made my heart swell. What was the demographic? Was that obviously I know you guys didn't do it. It was another company. Was it just a metro demographic, or do you know if they reached out to the more rural communities and kind of got a general consensus?
Yeah, there were some metro and then going out from there. Not many super rural communities, but there were suburbs, second string, third, and then out from there. Demographics, predominantly white people, 50%, male and female. I don't think we had any trans people or, out trans men or women. Yeah, but that's some of our demographics. Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. One quick question and one quick statement. Senator Marty mentioned something about the secular caucus and the constituency, and you deferred to Representative Freiberg that you might know more about what is it looking like? What's looking like this session?
Sure. Yeah, sorry if I neglected to cover that. So I sent out an initial email just to make sure everyone who was in the legislature last year still wanted to be a part of it. There were something like 24 people. I heard back from a few people. Everyone else was silent, which I interpret to mean they're still cool with it. So early, that I just sent at the beginning of this past week. So next week I plan to email all the new members. So I don't yet have those numbers, but
Okay.
there's about 24 returning members of the legislature who are still members of the Secular Government Caucus.
Which seems promising, and that's a great start. So thank you for doing that. And my statement, what I wanted to say, thank you all for doing the hard work you're doing, for having the courage, resilience, sometimes anger maybe, about doing these difficult things where you're pushing back against the status quo. These things we've talked about are rising, but this has long been a dominant, one culture over another. So building an equity that is a humanist value and making a space for all humans to thrive. Thank you.
One of the things I've noticed about the Christian nationalist movement is the comment all the time that I've heard they hear from the pulpit, vote your conscience, okay? Vote what God would want you to do. And one of the things that I've been kind of appalled at over the last decade or two is the fact that so many of the voting polls are in churches. And to me, that is just such a blatant disrespect for the separation of church and state. I've noticed now with the mail-in voting and the early voting that going to the polls is not so important on election day, but I do vote in every election, including the midterms. And so I'm wondering if your caucus can take some action to prevent these polls from being in churches. I don't like having to go to church to vote. And I wonder how many people don't vote just for the fact that they don't want to have to walk into the Lutheran church on the corner and cast their ballot. And so that's my question. Is there any movement at the state level on moving these polls out of the churches? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I feel like I should take the first stab at this one. I am chair of the elections committee in the House. I don't know of any efforts to do that. I'm also a former city council member from Golden Valley. I do know, a lot of cities are limited by what they have, what sorts of places can withstand large amounts of people coming in. And sometimes, churches do fit the bill of what they need and, meet the accessibility requirements and that sort of thing. I know there are limits about what can be put in polling places. I do know, I do have one story actually in Golden Valley. I forget if I was still on the council or if I was a legislator by that point, but there was a church that was a polling place, and they had a sign out front that said something like, make sure you vote for God-centered candidates or something like that, and at the polling place. So I emailed the city clerk, and they did respond really quickly, and that place is no longer a polling place. So I mean, certainly if you see something inappropriate like that, make sure you let the city election officials know. Most of them do want to make sure that the rules are followed there. And I do think you made a good point too about early voting. We now have no excuse absentee voting in Minnesota. We may very well be considering some proposals for true early voting in the legislature this year. So I mean, certainly if you're uncomfortable with your particular polling place, I do think voting early is an option. I frankly hope more people I hope we as a state move towards early voting. So.
Or mail balloting for just easy, where we send out mail ballots to people. But the only thing I'll add to what Mike said was that, like in my polling place, it's not even in our precinct, and it's a fairly large precinct because there weren't any other accessible buildings that would work. And it's a church, but they are very careful that you don't see any religious stuff on the way in or out. They're very careful about that. They're very respectful of that. But again, it's not one of the right-wing Christian churches either. There was a proposal several years ago to make sure every college campus had a polling place on their campuses, and I thought, in my precinct there is a Christian college, gated community. I thought you can't put a polling place in a gated community where you have not heavy security, but it's a gated community. And I think Mike's comment is exactly right. Try and be, if they're not respectful, if there's anything that's trying to do that, make sure your city council tries to change it, tries to find someplace nearby. But there's no simple answer to it because there aren't enough polling places that are accessible. And you're right. Voting absentee and voting early and so on are great ways to avoid that. But the other thing is make sure they enforce it. And the Secretary of State's office has been very good at trying to make sure we don't have this kind of problem.
Well, let's thank our guests again so much for showing up this afternoon. I want to invite them, if they're able to stay, and they may not be able to, but I don't know, able to stay if you can catch our legislator. I hope, Matt, you'll be able to stay for a little bit and chat with people. But we have refreshments that'll be just right in the back, and both at the back of the hall here and into the gallery where you can socialize and eat. Again, I want to encourage people, if you are not a member, to consider becoming a member of HumanistsMN, to support the work that we're doing and to get involved, because as our guest said, we need to be organized. I think one of the reasons the faith community and that language in Christian nationalism is because they're organized. We need to get organized. And so I encourage you to get involved with HumanistSMN, because we're trying to carry on the work. And or make a donation today or whatever, at least for the food and the drink. And the other thing I want to say is Suzanne told me that we have a preliminary mock-up of our billboards that are going to be put up in the coming weeks. And John, one of our techie guys in the back, is going to put them on, I guess, going back and forth with them. I don't know what John is going to do, but you're going to be able to see them. So look for them during our social hour to see what you think. anything else from my leaders, my board, anything else I should be saying? Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Hope to see you next month. Again, a Sunday afternoon over in St. Paul.